Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Reparations is part of a larger issue of tangibles that are owed, not merely because we built this country, which is a debt that this putrid nation could never repay, though we will make them get as close as possible, but also because there's another principle equally important at stake, one that we have to fully embrace wholeheartedly, and that's to start not taking no for an answer. Yes, we get turned down all the time, but the truth is, most of the time, especially when it comes to confronting these white supremacists, we walk in the door ready to fold, and everyone can see it. We expect to get turned down, and when it happens, for most of us, that's our cue to leave and not come back, and the enemy expects that because we've conditioned them to. They've seen us do it enough times. And you are never going to get anywhere by accepting no for an answer, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to please the person who's denying you, and that just doesn't work. Here's an example for you. The other evening I took part in a Twitter space, the very first one that I've ever taken part in. Now, this Twitter space was hosted by our sister Eve, and here's something you should know. She had been trying to get me to do a Twitter space with her for a while, in fact, actually about a year. She wanted to know if we could do an interview or whatnot, and I told her no, I don't do those. She asked, how about taking part in a Twitter space? And I told her no, I'm not really into those. Though, mostly just to be polite, I did say that if I decided to do so at some point in the future, I would try to keep her in mind. Now, you need to remember these exchanges were being done via personal messages on Twitter. Since then, I've seen her comments on my Twitter feed in response to my postings. You've probably heard me shout her out on the Moment of Truth every once in a while. Anyway, to make a long story short, she would occasionally send me a personal message inviting me to take part in a Twitter space that she was hosting. Now, keep in mind, I get a lot of messages sent to me through my YouTube channel, Twitter, Gmail. By the way, I regret having made the Gmail account public because I used to get very little spam, but after I made the Gmail account public, now I get inundated with it. Anyway, I'm not able to respond, so if I saw a message from Eve, I'd either retweet it since I wouldn't be able to participate, though in most cases, I didn't have time to really even respond, so I had to just keep it moving. Now, after her occasional prodding, I did finally decide to give a try to a Twitter space. I'm something of a Luddite, and Facebook and Twitter are constantly trying to find ways to coerce people into giving them their phone number, their ID, all kinds of personal information. And they don't do that for security purposes, by the way. If you believe that, you're criminally gullible. They do it because they sell the information to data brokers. Big data is a key revenue stream for these social media platforms. Twitter has always been a racist place, and with that South African apartheid reject Elon Musk in charge, it's even worse. And as for Mark Zuckerberg, I'm not sure if he's an android or one of the lizard people, but either way, I don't trust him and I don't think you should either. So that's how I feel on the subject of giving out phone numbers and personal information and such. Twitter spaces require that you use a phone, and they do that as a key part of their data collection on people, all of this data mining. I know that this may sound strange or unnecessary to some people, especially the folks who have their phones glued to their hands. I know they look at it as a necessary evil if you're going to be using these platforms because that's where everybody congregates, and I understand that. But I don't want these racist tech companies knowing anything about me at all. It's just my rule. Now, at any rate, for this year's New Black Media Month, for reasons I still don't completely understand, I finally decided to reach out to Eve this time, and I told her now I was willing to participate in a Twitter space. I told her that we would have to try to find some sort of workaround that would allow Twitter space to be used on a laptop, so she suggested I use an app called BlueStacks. Long story short, it didn't work. But she messaged me again this month about her Twitter space that she was hosting, and she asked if I'd be willing to attempt another try, and I said okay, but I told her we should do a test Twitter space the day before just to make sure that there's no technical problems. After all, we're trying to jerry-rig some stuff together here on a platform that we don't own, and you know how that is. I don't know anything about Twitter spaces, but I soon found out that it's not like YouTube where you can set a video to private. When you do a Twitter space, everybody knows about it. And for those of you who were alerted when Eve started her Twitter space, you knew when it went live and you got to hear some of the technical problems. The workaround wasn't working. So we kept at it, though, in real time until we found something that did work. Now, before I go any further, I want to say that I don't recommend anyone try to badger or nag me into anything. If you know anything about me for the last 15 years, you know that definitely backfires. I get a lot of people who try to do that, and that's part of the reason I did Tuesday's Moment of Truth about protecting institutions. I cite this story about Eve trying to get me to do a Twitter space as an illustration, not an invitation. My point is that her tactful unwillingness to take no for an answer was a big part of the reason that I finally decided to do a Twitter space with her. Too many times we settle for nothing by accepting the word no as a final answer. Now when it comes to what we're owed, that is non-negotiable. Someone tells us no, we are not supposed to accept that. That's why during the Twitter space I told you about the writer's strike in Hollywood that's going on right now. The last writer's strike had been 15 years ago. Back then, the Writers Guild was arguing with the studios over so-called new media. Basically, they were talking about online streaming. This was before all of these white media companies decided to start their own streaming services, back when pretty much the only game in town was Netflix. Everyone could see that streaming was the future, but we were still in the dying days of DSL, and true HD video through the internet wasn't quite a thing yet. 4K wasn't even on the radar, to say nothing about 60 frames per second. Now, during those writers' negotiations in 2007, the big studios were saying that the writers shouldn't push them on terms for new media or on residuals for home video sales. The studios are struggling to make money, they said. Nobody knows what the distribution would even look like, and after all, it would be years before streaming becomes the norm. It's all too soon for you to be pushing us on anything. Now, some of the Writers Guild members knew that that wasn't true, and some of them were saying that the writers needed to start moving into their own online spaces, if for no other reason than to show the studios that they can take their creativity elsewhere. But for the most part, the writers decided after a little while to cave in just so they could get back to work, and when they did, the union told its members that they would try again in a few more years. After all, how much could the landscape possibly change in just a few years? Well, as everyone knows, it changed completely. New media, that is streaming, has become the norm now. It's the primary way most people get their news and entertainment. But one of the things that changed is that streaming services like Netflix don't do 24 episodes a season like network television does. So writers who get a job on a streaming show make far less money than their network counterparts. You work for 8 weeks or so, then it's back to pitching ideas to studios as you try to line up your next gig, all this while living in Los Angeles, which is prohibitively expensive. Another problem that didn't get sorted out 15 years ago was how residuals, that means royalties, would be handled. Netflix, to all intents and purposes, doesn't pay much of anything in the way of royalties. They're not broadcast or even cable, so as far as Netflix is concerned, they don't have to play by the rules that the legacy broadcast networks have to play by. And that also includes ratings. A key part of how talent negotiates for more money is by knowing how well the show is doing in the ratings. Well, Netflix is notoriously secretive when it comes to their ratings. This is done in order to weaken the bargaining position of writers and actors when it comes time to negotiate new contracts. Needless to say, the traditional networks who do pay royalties and who have to disclose their ratings, they saw what Netflix has been doing, and it's the biggest streamer on the planet. And these networks, they all want to do the same thing because it would benefit them the same way it benefits Netflix. And what are they telling the writers? The exact same thing they were saying 15 years ago. This is all so new, we still don't know where this is going, we're not really making any money, so now is not the time to push us, etc., etc. 15 years ago, the Writers Guild had a choice. Dig in their heels, accept that they would have to endure some pain and hardship now in order to get the networks to pay what they should. The writers decided to go with a half measure instead. They were trying to get what they wanted without having to go all the way with it. And all they did was to kick the can down the road. Now, their position is weaker than it was 15 years ago. They're trying to have the fight that should have occurred a decade and a half ago today. And they're doing it when a number of the industry's business practices are decidedly against them, and a large number of their members are being paid less than they were 15 years ago. A strike is an economic game of chicken. Both sides try to hold out in the hopes the other guy runs out of money. This is what black people need to understand has to be done when it comes to our vote. The studios are doing the same old poor mouthing and telling people they're not really making any money as they always do, and what are the writers now saying? They're saying the same thing Henry Hill said in the movie Goodfellas. When the mafia tells you to pay the protection money, you gotta pay it. No excuses. You say business is kinda slow? F you, pay me. Your place burned down? F you, pay me. Your kid died? F you, pay me. Well, that's also what the Writers Guild is doing. The studios claim they didn't make much money last year? F you, pay us. Oh, one of your sound stages had a fire, you say? F you, pay us. A lot of your shows had to be canceled for low ratings? F you, pay us. Now, of course, I'm not comparing ourselves to the Writers Guild at all. But what I'm saying is that there's a lesson to be learned here. This isn't about being best buddies with the people in power. This is about getting what we're supposed to have. And if that entails making certain people unhappy, then so be it. Overcoming people's objections and attempts to deny you takes time, but persistence is the only way that it happens. If there's something you need to have, don't look for a way out, look for a way through. Because the question isn't whether you can afford to take out the time, effort, and sacrifice required to have what is yours. The real question is, can you afford not to? And the answer to that is no. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Shabazz, Frederick Dawkins, C. Hamilton Properties, Frederica Moore, and John Guillory. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.